Good evening, everyone. My name is Anna Seri, and I'm the President of the National Council of Jewish Women in Victoria. And on behalf of our COVID and absent CEO, Lisa Ezekiel, and our entire board, I'm thrilled to welcome you to the 2024 Fanny Reading Human Rights Lecture, and to be doing it in partnership with our national peak body, the National Council of Jewish Women Australia. I'm extending a warm welcome to all our Victorian and national board members here tonight, past and present, and I'm excited to welcome Nikki Marzak, our national board member and chair of their Social Justice Committee, to give our acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Anna.
Can you hear that?
Good evening. Yeah, is that okay? Thank you for having me. National Council of Jewish Women Australia would like to acknowledge the Bunwurrung and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and all traditional owners of the land that is Australia. We recognise the traditional owners' continuing connection to the land, waterways and community. We pay respect to elders past and present, and we acknowledge their stories, traditions and living cultures. As Jewish women, we specifically honour and acknowledge First Nations women who, like our matriarchs, are strong, brave, determined and resilient. We would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the land of Israel, the Jewish people. We pray for the return of our hostages and that those protecting our country on the ground stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Also, just a very warm welcome to David Southwick, who's joined us tonight. Thanks, David, for taking the time. From its beginning, founded by the remarkable Dr. Fanny Reading, National Council of Jewish Women has aimed to serve, in Reading's words, our religion, our people and the country in which we live. At the first council meeting in 1923, Reading started an Immigrants Welfare Committee to meet every boat to welcome migrants arriving in Australia, and early council activities included healing the needy with warm clothes knitted in lounge room knitting circles. Op shops and kosher meals on wheels were historically useful tools for community service, and over time the council has been willing and able to change with and provide for the needs of the community in meaningful and relevant ways. For almost 100 years, the National Council of Jewish Women in Victoria has been a beacon for women in our community. Through each of our programs, we're supporting women in ways that are making a real difference. The JAM project mentors young girls at pivotal moments in their lives. Caring Mums provides emotional support for new mothers. Our newly launched Accelerator program helps professional women amplify their impact. And our Connect programs offers our seniors a sense of belonging and purpose. Critically, over the last year, our advocacy work has been brought into sharp focus. On October the 7th, the world witnessed a horrific and unfathomable act of violence, the scale of which has left us reeling and broken. Jewish communities across the globe have been grappling with the shock of that day and the growing sense of betrayal, both from those who've attacked us and from institutions, governments and movements that have long positioned themselves as champions of human rights. In response, National Council, both Victoria and Australia and around Australia, has met with organisations like UN Women Australia. We've written to media platforms like Women's Agenda. We've stood alongside community at vigils and rallies, and we've activated together with other women's organisations in our community. More recently, National, under the exceptional leadership of their new president, Linda Ben-Menashe, has hosted boardroom lunches for non-Jewish women of influence to hear from Jewish women's lived experiences post-October the 7th. We have been stunned and disappointed at the silence, the inaction and the imbalance. And whilst we've found strength in the collective, we've been clearly sidelined by the institutions and movements for whom we have always stood up. It's that sense of betrayal that has inspired tonight's critical conversation that feels equal parts personal, urgent and necessary. Every year, to mark International Human Rights Day, which happens to be today, the 10th of November, and to honour our founder, Dr. Fanny Reading, we host this lecture. This year's exploration feels like one of our most important yet. How can Jewish women reclaim our space within a fundamentally changed human rights framework? Tonight, we will explore how to reclaim that space. Despite the pain and the disillusionment, we, Jewish women, stand here as agents of our own justice. We'll discuss the tools we need to push back against the silence, to demand recognition of our experiences, and to hold those who claim to protect human rights accountable when they fail to include us. Together, we will reclaim our space in the human rights discourse. Together, we will build a world where every woman's voice can be heard, and National Council of Jewish Women is proud to be a driving force in that advocacy. I am now very delighted to introduce Lexi Kowal, who's going to be moderating this evening. You've got an amazing panel. We don't have Ruth yet? No. Lexi, it's all right. Lexi will introduce. Lexi Kowal is a seasoned strategy consultant at Deloitte. She specialises in strategy and transformation for government, healthcare and social services clients. In addition to her professional accomplishments, Lexi has served as Vice President and Board Director of Zionism Victoria for several years, and in the aftermath of October 7th, she has led vital efforts to unite our community, combat rising anti-Semitism, and foster solidarity during challenging times. Lexi has been an active volunteer on our advocacy committee for nearly 8 years. I've had the pleasure of working with her very closely, and she's made significant contributions to our Make Space for Her campaign, propelling more women into leadership positions. I'm going to leave this amazing audience, Lexi, in your capable hands.
We're here tonight to engage in a very important conversation about reclaiming our rights, navigating human rights spaces, and fostering solidarity and resilience in challenging times. I'm Lexi Kowal. I'm going to be a moderator, and I'm going to take a seat to make it a bit more comfortable. As Anna said, I'm a long-standing member of the National Council of Jewish Women of Australia, Victoria's Advocacy Committee. It's a mouthful, but a really important organisation and committee. And by day, a strategy consultant. I also am the Vice President of Zionism Victoria, so it'll be of no secret that I'm very passionate about Israel and a passionate feminist as well. I'm truly thrilled to be joined by three remarkable women here today. I know the seats next to me are empty and the screen behind me, but they will fill up in just a moment. So our discussion tonight will centre around a few key themes. First, we'll talk about the impact of October 7 on Jewish women. Second, about human rights advocacy. We'll hear insights from Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari on her work in international organisations to seek justice for victims. We'll talk about community resilience and solidarity. We'll discuss the grassroots initiatives and collective actions that have emerged with the Jewish community post-October 7. And lastly, hopefully to leave you with a bit of hope and a pep in your step as you walk out of this challenging but important conversation, we'll talk about future directions and envision a more inclusive and empowered future for Jewish women in human rights advocacy. So to begin with, I'm honoured to introduce Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari. Hopefully we can bring her up on screen. Fantastic. It's my honour to introduce you, Professor, a foremost expert in family law and international human rights. As the founding academic director of the Rackman Center for Advancement of the Status of Women at Bar-Ilan University, Ruth has been at the forefront of gender justice and advocacy for many years. Following the horrific events of October 7, she co-founded the Dinah Project, tirelessly working to secure justice and recognition for the victims of sexual violence and gender-based atrocities. Her experience on a UN committee, coupled with her remarkable advocacy, has provided her direct access to decision-makers and international human rights bodies. Ruth's recent efforts have been instrumental in mobilising a fact-finding mission to Israel for post-October 7, and we're privileged to hear from her tonight. Following our conversation, we'll also have two more panellists join me up here in these chairs. We'll welcome Lillian, Kline and Ora-Tali Korbl to join us for a panel discussion, but I'll hold off on introducing you just for now. And together with their insights, it'll deepen our exploration of resilience, advocacy and the way forward. So let's dive into this vital conversation. Please join me in welcoming Ruth. Ruth, can you see us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can see you, I can hear you, but I'm actually seeing your back, Lexi.
Oh. Let's change some things up. How about that?
Yes, I mean, it would be a bit weird.
Perfect. How's that? Can you see me now?
Yes,
Beautiful.
That's better. That's better. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, Ruth, I'd like to kick off with a question, a very broad question, to hear a little bit about your experiences, particularly post-October 7. So, Ruth, what challenges have you encountered in your post-October 7 human rights landscape, and what progress, if any, do you feel has been made so far?
That's a huge question, as you know. I'd just like to say first that I'm sorry I cannot be there physically with you, and I'm grateful for you for inviting me. But it is really complicated to do such a trip in such intense times, and the intensity is really what. I think characterizes this whole past year since October 7 of last year. The challenges are on and off, but they started on October 8 and they really did not subside since then. On October 7, I was actually not in Israel. I was in the middle of a lecture tour talking about the judicial and regime overhaul, which Israel went through the year before that.
That really takes us back, doesn't it, to just where we were over a year ago.
Only a year ago, and we have to acknowledge the fact that this is not really over. It is still very much ongoing inside Israel, but now it is all in the midst of this horrific war post-October 7. So I wasn't at home. I was visiting in Copenhagen, lecturing there, and visiting my son and my daughter-in-law, on the way to continue to the US, to continue the lecture tour and fundraising for the Rackman Center. And on October 7, like everybody else, I was just unable to really believe what we were seeing on the screens. But the following day, when I realized that Hamas had so many hours uninterrupted at the Gaza envelope, in military bases, in civilian communities, and starting to hear from people, from survivors, and based on my experience on the UN committee that you mentioned, 12 years on the CEDAW committee, hearing from women from all over the world who had experienced horrific atrocities, it was very clear to me that there's no way that sexual violence had not been part of that horrific attack, massacre. And I immediately reached out to my allies, to my former colleagues on the CEDAW committee and on other UN entities with whom I collaborated before and with whom I continue to be in touch. For instance, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Special Rapporteur on Enforced Disappearances, and of course UN Women. Together with Professor Francis Radai from the Hebrew University, we drafted a letter, and I emailed it on October 9 and expected responses. And that's when we started realizing that the cry for recognition, for acknowledgement, and for condemnation of Hamas atrocities, crimes against humanity, was not going to be answered as much as we expected, and that the journey is going to be very, very hard. On the same day, I also reached out to my former colleague and friend with whom I worked on the CEDAW committee and who left the committee to assume the position that was clear to me that that's the position which is most relevant on the UN to engage with us on sexual violence in conflict. She's the special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence in conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten. And I called her and said, Pramila, we need you here. And her first response was, do you know if it really happened? And only later I understood what actually stood behind that response, based on her experience and knowing how difficult it is to claim for recognition and for justice for survivors of sexual violence in conflict. She already knew what we were going to stand up against. Now, if we look back on these reactions, we really have to differentiate between various people and bodies and entities. Because we do have allies on the international human rights world, but we also have many enemies. And we have all those who are like between. So if we want to be honest, UN Women had disappointed, and the outrage against UN Women is justified. I have the data of analyzing all their tweets and their statements and what they said about Palestinian women in Gaza and what they had not said about Israeli women and about Hamas sexual violence on October 7. But then we have Pramila Paten's report, who was really the game changer when she published it in the beginning of March. And it is the opening point for all the international, the more formal responses by states acknowledging that rape and gang rape did happen on at least 6 or 7 locations on October 7. And I know I'm taking a little bit too much time on this first question, but I want it to be that we all understand what we are now facing. I think that we are no longer facing the total denial. Of course, there are those who still deny everything and even deny the whole attack of October 7. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the more reasonable and the more sophisticated kind of denial, like phase 2 of denial, which acknowledges that, yes, there were some rapes, but women always get raped in war, and it was not systematic, and it was not part of the plan of Hamas. In other words, it is not that Hamas is or has been using sexual violence as a tool of war. And this is now our goal. The goal of the DINA project and others who operate in this field is to take all the evidence that we have, all the information that we have, some of it had not been published yet, and to prove, to put all the dots together and to prove, to argue and to prove that it had been premeditated, it was systematic, and it all points out to Hamas' preconceived plan to use sexual violence as a weapon of war during their horrific attack on October 7.
Now, Ruth, I might just use a little bit of chutzpah and jump in. Look, your reflections and your learnings, they're sending shivers through the room, through myself. It truly is atrocious. And we want to explore in a moment about the work that you've been doing with your organisation post-October 7. But I think what comes to mind for me is, was this a surprise? For so many years you worked with the UN. For so many years we worked with the stakeholders who could have and should have stood up for Israeli women and for women more generally post-October 7. Were you surprised with this reaction on October 8 and since then?
This question is also not very easy to answer. I mean, the short answer is yes, I was surprised. I was heartbroken. I am still devastated. However, I also look back at the chronology of everything that was known on October 7, 8, 9, 10, what was known when it was known a few months afterwards, and the situation now. And I also I take a more comprehensive outlook at other conflict zones in the world and other places where they had been women who were subjected, and men too, who were subjected to conflict-related sexual violence. And I did some learning over this past year, and I do realize that it is always very difficult to prove, and there is a difference between October 7 and other conflict zones where sexual violence was used as a weapon of war. October 7 is, unfortunately, tragically, sadly, unique in some in more than one sense. First of all, we do not have survivors who speak up about October 7. Most of them had actually been murdered immediately during or a little after they were assaulted. And those who survived were taken to Gaza. And there are a few survivors in Israel who are unable to speak. They are still being treated to overcome the trauma. If they ever manage to overcome this, it is doubtful if they ever really speak out. Of course, there is the immensely brave Amit Susana, with whom I just traveled 2 weeks ago to the UN to an event commemorating the 15 years of the mandate of Pramila Patten, and she stood there in front of the General Assembly. She stood there next to a Yazidi survivor, to a survivor from Ukraine, from Darfur, from Sudan, and that was a huge recognition that she is a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence. But her assault, she was assaulted in Gaza. And we're now talking about October 7 in Israel, right? Not in captivity, but in Israel. So there are no survivors, no hard forensic evidence, because they were all buried with the victims. But we do have huge amount of testimonies, first-hand testimonies, eyewitnesses, ear witnesses, footage, photos of the first responders, what they had seen, and that's what we want to argue and to claim. But realizing that this is a different situation from other areas, I can understand, in retrospect, I can understand the somewhat hesitation during the first few weeks. But on November 14, the police made a press conference for the foreign media, and they had shown the testimony of an eyewitness of October 7, who described in details, graphic details, what she witnessed. That was the point when the tide should have shifted. That was the point when all the organizations, women's organizations, human rights organizations, the general left, adhering to believe women and to the Me Too movement, they should have accepted what this eyewitness described, and her testimony was corroborated by findings from the area itself. She was taken by the police, and she spotted the place where she hid in the bushes, and she spotted the place where the gang rape and the mutilation took place, and there were some personal items there, not hers, so of the victim, and that wasn't refuted. So why did UN Women did not say anything until December 2nd, and then only after the Secretary General said something hesitantly about reports coming of sexual violence? Why didn't they say anything after Pramila's report was reported? Why didn't they condemn? Why didn't they say anything after the COI report was published in June? After Amit Susana's testimony in the General Assembly? So again, to your question, it's a mixed answer. But overall, I think that the response of the international human rights community is a huge failure. It's really a huge failure of all of humanity, not just of us Israeli or Jewish women.
No, I hear you, Ruth, and I think, I'm not sure if you can see the room, but we're all shaking our heads, as we have been for the last 400 days since October 7 happened. And I think National Council of Jewish Women of Australia, Victoria in particular, were outspoken in their condemnation, in their disappointment with UN Women in particular. This is something that globally there's been outcry for, and yet that response came so late and so little in the end. But I think if we can take from your learnings and from your experience, I think let's flip for a moment to the positives or the momentum that you've picked up in these 400 days. And it's baffling to think it has been so long. Could you share some insights of some of the progress that you might have seen? If we sat here in November last year, we would be disappointed with no momentum. But we have seen some movement when it comes to the UN in some capacities. We have seen some movement when it comes to our allies outside of the Jewish community. What has the Dinah Project, what have you been doing since October 7 and what's been working so far?
Well, we've been giving hundreds and hundreds of briefings, meetings, interviews to diplomats, to ambassadors, ministries of foreign affairs, whether those who came to Israel. Many of us traveled abroad, really across the board, Europe, North America, Southeast Asia. And I think that the progress that we have seen on the international diplomatic front is very much attributed to our work and work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others. As I said before, the game changer has been the fact-finding mission of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, Pramila Patten, and the report, the unprecedented report that she published in March, unprecedented in the sense that her work is always only being incorporated into the Secretary General's own annual report, which is published in April, but this time engaging in what she had not been doing before, that is collecting the information, gathering and documenting the information herself, and not just relying on information that she's being given by others, by other mandated UN bodies. So that's the unprecedented thing. So she published the independent report in March, and that has been since then the starting point for any other mechanism or committee or anybody who engages on the issue of what happened on October 7. That has also served the Commission of Inquiry report that was published in June. Commission of Inquiry is, we can say, is a hostile body to Israel, and even they, in their first report, they went further than Patton's report because they actually attributed the sexual violence to Hamas, and they used the words a pattern of attacks. And they said that the rapes were not sporadic, but they were a pattern in the attack itself. And all this really gives us the lead to continue to develop and put all the evidence that we have together, which is what we are planning, what we are now doing, the Dinah Project, 6 expert women, including former district court judge and deputy Solicitor General of Israel, Judge Nava Ben-Or, Ayelet Razin Beit-Or, who was the former CEO of the Israel, of the National Authority for the Advancement of Women, former Solicitor General of the Army, Colonel Sharon Zagagi-Pinchas. We are now working on a report, as I said, that collects all the evidence and the information that we have to put it together to prove the intentionality, the systematization and the intentionality that is behind the sexual violence of October 7, to come together to the bottom line of putting Hamas as an organization that uses and employs sexual violence as a weapon of war. And our website, which we just launched on October 7, 2024, our website contains all the relevant information, including the relevant UN reports with analysis, with pointing to the highlights of the reports, explaining them in more simple words, media publications that are relevant, international law that is relevant to this, and it is there to serve all those who want to learn more, to find out more, to have the facts in front of them so that they can be part of this initiative to set the record straight, to achieve the ultimate justice recognition for the victims of the sexual violence of October 7. So I can say with full confidence that we are seeing progress. It's very difficult, very hard, and there are also many setbacks. And I think we also need to acknowledge that Israel itself is also responsible for setbacks, because if we understand that Palestinian detainees had been subjected to inappropriate treatment, it is not the same, I'm not saying for a moment that it is the same of what Hamas engaged in on October 7. And it is definitely not part of a plan, and it is not the same level of what we're talking about. We're not talking about atrocities, we're not talking about mutilation. But if there is fault on our side, it should be investigated. It should be also put up in the open. We don't have what to hide. We need to acknowledge it and to bring those accountable, to prosecute, to have accountability on our side too, when we want to demand accountability on the other side. And we should not be in a position for a moment that the external world could in anyhow make some false symmetry between the two. But to do that, we have to acknowledge our own faults as well. And we also have to engage with other victims on other parts of the world. As we speak, there are about 20 areas in the world where there are survivors and possibly ongoing victims of ongoing conflict-related sexual violence. We have to stand up for them as well, not only when it concerns our own people, our own sisters.
Ruth, I might just pick up on that point, and one final question just for us, Ruth, before I invite our other panels to join us. Look, but before I do jump into the question, I think the sentiment in the room here is we are so grateful for the work that you are doing. It's so critical, and it is so disappointing that it has to happen. But the work that you've just pointed to of the Dinar Project, it truly is remarkable. So thank you, first and foremost. And I think you've just pointed to where our community or women at large, human rights bodies at large need to be focusing their efforts right here and right now. And I'm curious in your reflections on what's changed since October 7? I'm a few years out of my university campus days, and on university campus you're taught believe women. That's the first and foremost thing that is at front of mind when it comes to sexual violence and when it comes to feminism, when it comes to values in our society. Until October 7, 2023, believe women was something that we could all agree on. And then October 7 happened, and something's changed, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Could we hear your reflections on what's changed in the landscape post-October 7?
I think that to answer this question, we cannot really separate between October 7 and what ensued after post-October 7. And by that, I'm referring both to the unprecedented anti-Semitic tide that had overtaken basically the whole world, and the ongoing war in Gaza, which sadly, I believe that we have reached a point where this war should long ago had ended with a hostage deal to free all those who are still alive in Gaza. Out of the 101 who are there, we know that about half of them are still alive, and they could have been freed already, and they should have been set free. and they should have been set free together with a hostage, with a deal to end the war and to come to a pact that would put the whole region into a new order. And the Israeli government is not doing that. And this only adds fuel to the anti-Semitic tide that had overtaken the whole world. And this is now what impacts the reaction that we are still seeing from all those organizations whom we had deemed as allies, who are unable to separate the one day of October 7 from the rest of the events. I do think that we still have to insist and demand that a clear and strong claim of saying that rape, sexual violence can never be deemed a form of resistance and can never be a legitimate tool in any fight, and anybody who claims to be a resistant fighter or freedom fighter cannot purport to be one if they are engaging in such atrocities and crimes against humanity, including sexual violence. We have to insist that this is put in one side, and the rest of the developments and whatever other whatever took place post October 7 is being judged according to international law. And I'm afraid that the failure of many of the human rights organizations and the global left and many women's organizations in the world, the failure was the inability to separate the two and the inability to acknowledge the fact that Israel, which had always been seen and is also being seen now as the ultimate aggressor, that Israel had also been a victim. And Israel's citizens and Israeli women and men had been victim on October 7 and had been subjected to the most horrific crime against humanity of sexual violence as a weapon of war. And the Palestinians, who have always been seen and are now also being seen as the ultimate victims, had on that day had been the aggressors and had been those to be condemned and to be blamed. And most of the organizations are unable to do this shift and to understand that things are more complicated than just black and white as they would like to see it.
No, thank you so much for your reflections, and I think you've really hit the nail on the head. If you were to read a headline, log onto TikTok, have a look at your favorite influencer on Instagram right now, you'd come to believe that this is black and white. This isn't very difficult. It's very simple to understand what's happening here. It doesn't quite take as much experience as Professor Ruth to understand that when it comes to Israel, there is so much nuance. There is so much history there to understand, and there's also the reality and the evidence of October 7 that we need to point to understand what's happened here and where we need to be paying attention. So thank you, Ruth, for sharing your invaluable insights. Your work, it's truly remarkable, but more than that, it's important, and we're so grateful to you for it. At this point, I am going to zoom out a little bit. We've been speaking for the conversation thus far, specifically about the experience of women on October 7 in the human rights landscape since then, but particularly about Israel. And we're going to zoom out a little bit and invite our two speakers onto the stage. If you'd like to come and join me up here. and speak a little bit broader about how Jewish women can navigate the human rights landscapes and our communal landscapes, and what our experience has been both here in Australia with Lillian and with Ora-Tali, and also with Ruth on screen. But it is my privilege to introduce these two phenomenal women to my left. First, we have Lillian Kline. Lillian is Head of Philanthropy at the Victor Smorgon Group and co-founder of Project A, an organisation I'm sure many in the room will know, but a grassroots organisation created after October 7 here in our local community. Lillian also founded Impact Outfit, an organisation supporting impactful social and environmental investments. With a background in human rights law and experiencing directing initiatives such as the Pathways to Politics program for women at Melbourne University, her contributions to our discussion promise to be profound, so please welcome Lillian. Joining us as well is Ora-Tali Korbl, who brings extensive experience from her legal career as well, most recently as a senior associate in commercial property law. Now, amidst a career transition, Ora-Tali continues to serve our community through roles with organisations like Liebler Yavneh College and Augis, and her perspective on balancing advocacy and family life, as well as her passion for community engagement, will provide us with a valuable and relatable insight into the resilience of Jewish women. So please welcome Ora-Tali. Fantastic. So, we'll continue our conversation, and we are looking to zoom out, but of course bring those insights about October 7 in particular. So Lillian and Ora-Tali, I'll start with you. What's your experience been like in the aftermath of October 7?
Sure. So I was working in a senior role at Australia's largest law firm, which will remain nameless. And it's a firm that's typically been pretty outspoken on LGBTQI plus rights and women's rights and human rights, and then at times it borders on virtue signalling, but I do think it is genuinely part of the brand and the culture at that firm. But then October 7th happened and there was just radio silence, and I reached out to the CEO at the time to express my disappointment, and I was told it was too political to touch. The war in Ukraine was not too political to touch, but this was. And I said that I couldn't and wouldn't work until a statement was put out. I wasn't looking for a media statement or anything like that. You're dealing with a law firm, but I honestly was after just at least an internal email that, one, acknowledged that October 7th happened, and two, denounced the atrocities and anti-Semitism in general. And after a couple of days, a very power of email, internal, firm-wide, went out, and it just felt short of the mark. And so I actually resigned on that basis, and I let them know that I was moving to a Jewish firm, to ABL, and so at the firm level there was nothing, but then on a micro level I actually had two colleagues that I was quite close to. They're both young gay men, and they almost had the opposite. So due to their cultural affiliations, they felt like they had to take a side, and the one actually just stopped talking to me. And I had been vocal, but professional and not enough to make anyone uncomfortable, and that spoke volumes. So very comfortable with my decision to have left there, but that was a real shock to the system, because these people are representing themselves as well-educated, rational, problem-solving individuals, but to this they couldn't apply that.
Such strength for you to take that leap and to tell your employers where your values lie. So congratulations on such an important decision. Lillian, I might shift to you. What's life been like for you post-October 7?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I feel really privileged to be up here with such amazing people and to be in the company of so many brilliant women, colleagues, and my mum. Hi, Mum. What has life been like? It's hard to remember what life was like before October 7. Ora-Tali and I were chatting just before, and I said a couple of weekends ago I went away for the weekend with 3 non-Jewish girlfriends And it was like being on a different planet for 24 hours. And we talked about family and children and career and, house decorations. And I was like, that's what it used to be like. And I made that comment to my girlfriends, how refreshing. And then they got all kind of, nervous. Oh, we can talk about the conflict. I said, no, we don't need to talk about the conflict. So in my professional world, I sort of work at the intersection of investing, philanthropy and social causes. So really come into very regular contact with a lot of people who are running, human rights organisations, progressive organisations, arts organisations. So absolutely the first, after the initial shock of the first few days, it was either the silence from organisations who had taken very, very vocal stances on the most recent issue, which had been the referendum, to outright statements that were just I felt completely unacceptable, particularly from a philanthropic perspective, and had the challenge of being a financial supporter of a number of organisations that were making statements that were completely at odds with, first of all, at odds with what we thought was acceptable, but also at odds with what their mandates were. That began a long process of challenging conversations and working out what you can and can't say to people who you've supported and had long time relationships with. But I felt pretty lucky in the sense that, probably 2 days after October 7, and many people here in the room know the story, a couple of us got together, and shout out to my co-founder Moran Dvir in the audience, and we basically put together a WhatsApp group, and that has kind of acted as a life force for me. And really, what it was in the initial days was a coming together of women to express their grief, despair, betrayal, the kind of what the fuck is happening in the world right now. It wasn't just women, it was also men as well, but predominantly driven by women. And then that really sort of shifted very quickly into action bias of, there's nothing worse than feeling like terrible things are happening and you're helpless. So very quickly, it wasn't called Project A at that point. I don't think it was just the WhatsApp group, one of many, many that started in those days. And it was a coming together of people who wanted to do something to basically make themselves feel better about, the atrocities that were happening overseas, but also what we saw unfolding. And I feel like what's happening in the last year, every week or almost every day, I feel like I've seen it all and I'm not going to be shocked. And then again, you're shocked by something else. So.
No, I think in both of your stories and in Ruth's as well, we hear this theme of shock and disappointment. I think something that really resonates for me is I thought our community was well engaged and well placed. For decades, if not centuries, globally, the Jewish community have been active in our society to ensure that if an atrocity were to happen, if we needed support, we'd be well placed to gain that support, particularly in women's circles. And I think those themes that you've just spoken to, that shock and disappointment, really resonate. But there are lots of inspiring activities that have happened, and you alluded to Project A. I'm a member. I'm sure most of us here aren't. If you're not, join the WhatsApp group. But I think what's come from October 7, the mobilisation, particularly of Jewish women that we've seen, has been really remarkable. So I'm hoping we'll start with Lillian perhaps, if you could share some examples of how you've seen our community mobilise in response to October 7. And then Ruth, I'm really eager to hear your reflections on globally what you've seen, what opportunities we might be missing here as well.
So I think to start with the silver lining, I think the activation of people who the non-usual suspects. So a lot of people who probably didn't have to reckon with their Jewish identity in the past, or who hadn't been defined by their Jewish identity, who hadn't thought about their Jewish identity, had obviously been activated by the events of October 7 and the unbelievable explosion in anti-Semitism. And that includes, friends who, married, have non-Jewish partners, or people who were sort of really on the periphery of the Jewish community and had not been connected. So I think the silver lining is that so many people have now kind of, returned, rediscovered, re-engaged, call it what you want, with their Judaism in whatever form that looks like. And that's been a real positive. And I think what that has led, because whether or not you wanted to be defined by your Jewishness or not, that was the experience that many people were having. No one was asking business owners what their position was on, Palestine and Israel before graffitiing their buildings. But I think what was really powerful is just a coming together of people to kind of work out, well, what are our skills? Where can we apply those skills? A big sort of education, not just, but for me as well, of like who are the Jewish community organisations who are doing the advocacy work and who represents us. It was not something that I'd really had to pay attention to. I was always happy and glad that there was this infrastructure and alphabet soup of Jewish organisations. It wasn't relevant to me in my day-to-day. All of a sudden, that was, became incredibly relevant. So again, the role that Project A or the WhatsApp groups played was really just connecting people to organisations, or organisations to funding, or causes to things that, resources that they needed. And some of the things that we organised early on and, relevant to our conversation today was a vigil of women, just to basically come together and shine a light on the fact that there were still hostages, hundreds of hostages at that stage, sexual violence and systematic sexual violence that had not been acknowledged. And what we did was, bring people together to basically commemorate and talk about that and shine a light on it. And we found actually pretty early on that the media was very interested in what we had to say. And I know we're going to talk about this later on, but it's something that I think, some people get nervous to speak, and that's, most people get nervous to speak. And I always say to people, you don't need to be an expert in anything other than your own experiences. And that's what the media really wanted to hear. That, as a mother, you had children who went to a Jewish school who were, and your children were told not to wear school uniform, outside of school, or that the school, has these procedures that, is not normal in any other school, Muslim or otherwise, to be honest. Journalists and media wanted to hear that. So we were often providing speaking, notes, or just, some advice to people who wanted to take a stand but didn't know how they could. And again, here to say that every single person can be an advocate and an activist. You don't have to be an expert, really, in anything.
No, that is really motivating, and I think it's important for all of us here to remember we have a voice, whether it is your actual voice, whether it's the device in your pocket, or whether it's speaking to your colleagues, but whatever it is, we have an opportunity to capitalise on the momentum that we're slowly seeing, but we also have a responsibility as Jewish women to leverage that opportunity. Ora-Tali, how about you? What have you seen in terms of activity post-October 7 and coming together from our community?
So I think we can all attest to that general sense of like achdut and unity across communities globally. When I turned my mind to this question, it was within the context of the challenges facing women specifically, and obviously this whole sexual violence piece. And so, my husband will attest to this, consistent with my view on life in general. I expect more from Jewish men in this context. There's been a lot of women who have organised vigils and set up WhatsApp groups and had challah bakes and are leading that advocacy piece. And I'm not sure that I've seen that from the men. And it's complicated because it's still, we're living it in real time, we are fighting the war. The level of sexual violence that we saw on October 7th is unprecedented to a certain extent. I think just by virtue of the fact that they're a different gender, it's hard to relate to sexual violence in any way. But then you take it up a notch to breasts being cut off, and again, it seems so unfathomable. So I can understand that there's that barrier there of relatability, but I would really love to see Jewish men step up in this context, because as Professor Halperin-Kaddari alluded to before, we are, and excuse the colloquialism, but it's just what comes to mind, we're going to be shoving shit uphill to try and prove to the international community that these things that seem so macabre actually happened.
No, and I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. It's who else can we turn to? We all have jobs, we all have families, we all have responsibilities that existed long before October 7 and will exist long after. And we're finding new opportunity and new time to invest because it's necessary. But where else can we turn? I think you spoke about Jewish men, of which I think there's about 2 in the room. My dad's one of them. Hi, Dad. But what I've been particularly interested in is, what about our allies in other community groups? I think our community here locally have seen remarkable leadership. People like Nova Peris come to mind, who spoke at National Council event not that long ago. How can we, I suppose, foster greater solidarity, leverage our allies, call upon our allies? Ruth, I might actually throw to you first up, if you still can hear us online. Beautiful. About where are our allies for the Jewish community? Where are they hiding? And how can we, as a community, both at the grassroots level and at the professional level like yourself, how can we leverage those allies better to have greater outcomes for the Jewish community, for women?
I first want to address the question of silver lining with respect to our experiences within the Jewish community. I think it is really very important to point to to the development of much closer ties between us in Israel and our sisters around the world. Primarily North America, but also as we are now experiencing with a place which is perhaps a little more remote, such as Australia. And the same is with women in the UK and Jewish women's organizations in many places in Europe. I think that it was the realization that, unfortunately, we share very, very similar challenges, and the understanding that the harm caused for women in Israel was, in fact, intended to cause harm to the whole Jewish nation and to the whole Jewish community, and not just those who are in Israel. I think that really led to a mobilization of collaboration and partnership, and the realization that we have to work together. And I can also say that the DINA project was, still is, being assisted and collaborating and giving assistance to the mobilization of such organizations in the US as Jewish Women's International, as I believe Israeli Women, and we are in the midst of even strengthening our working relations. And this is actually very, very much needed to your second part of the question of our other allies. I'm a strong believer in our need to form relations with other women's organizations. In fact, also on the other side of the spectrum and of the conflict. One of my most heartening experiences was in March, when I was invited to speak in Toronto as part of at a conference organized by Muslim Council against the Canadian Muslim Council against anti-Semitism, which I have never heard about before. But there were hundreds and hundreds who attended that conference, and one of the speakers was Rahil Raza, who is a devout activist against anti-Semitism and against Islamist radicalism and extremism. And it is clear to me that she and they are not alone in their stand and their fight against jihadists, fundamentalists, extremists within their own communities. And these are the people with whom we should strengthen, we should form ties and strengthen our connections. And that also goes together with fighting for the rights of for instance, Yazidi women who had been harmed in unimaginable ways by jihadist, Islamist fundamentalism exercised against them by ISIS in a similar way to what Hamas exercised on October 7. And women from Nigeria who had been harmed by Boko Haram, who are also an Islamist, extremist, jihadist organization. So we have to morally and strategically to form these allies across the spectrum and across the globe. And for that, we also need to be united together, again, not just as Israeli women, but as Jewish women worldwide.
No, very much hear you, Ruth, and I think you've got a call to action there. Some homework for all of us in the room here today is to find those allies. I think what the story that you told about the Canadian community, the room here is shocked, impressed, and hopeful. In a way that we perhaps haven't been. And so I think we've all got some homework to find who are those allies and who are those groups that we perhaps haven't engaged with over the last just over a year, but may, as you said, strategically and morally align with us. Look, one more question to the panel and then we'll open up. So you're all on notice for some questions from the audience in a moment. But I think we've reflected on the atrocities. We've reflected on what's happened since. We've reflected on the disappointment that we've felt, but also the motivation that our community has had in some aspects. So a question I might start in the room here and then finish off with you, Ruth, is what's your vision for the role of Jewish women in advocating for human rights moving forward? Where to next? It's a big one. Sorry, Lillian.
No, that's okay. I'm just reflecting on the fact that it feels at the moment quite hard to be a woman in the world today and quite hard to be a Jewish woman in the world today. The role models that our young men have are not necessarily the role models that we would have liked, and it's sometimes, like I was just checking before I came up because I know that even in the most recent Queensland election, abortion was on the agenda again. So we just cannot take anything for granted around women's rights ever. Even when you think in 2024 we have access to the healthcare that we need, we absolutely cannot take that right for granted. And obviously we've seen an outcome in the United States which also puts women's rights very much at risk. So I just wanted to say, a difficult time to be a woman. That said, my vision is that as women, we feel empowered, we feel engaged, and we feel activated to be our best selves, to be the women that, and I could tell so many stories. I'm just thinking, I'm the chair of an organisation that works with teenage girls in schools. It's called Flourish Girl, and it's about rites of passage, and it teaches young teenagers good mental health practices. And even in the last few years, we had to change our name from Flourish Girl to Flourish Journey because the government made it difficult to have girl in the title of a not-for-profit organisation. It's a whole other story. If it's interesting, I'll talk to you about it separately. But my point is, it's even hard to be, it feels sometimes hard to even claim to be a girl and a woman with all this kind of noise around us. So my wish is that we feel empowered as girls, as women. We use whatever strengths we have as women and as humans to support one another. Moran's going to laugh because she often hears me say there's a special place in hell for women who don't support other women, and to support other women who are doing good work. And you don't have to be an expert, and you don't have to be brilliant at everything, but every person in this room has power to have a conversation. When you pick up your coffee in the morning and the barista asks you, how are you doing? You can say, really shit because there was graffiti on my children's school today, or really shit because I had to walk past a sticker that had the Magen David on it crossed out. And it's the human interaction that people remember. When we've had meetings with potential allies, some who are real, some who could not be allies, it's the stories that we tell and the experiences that we've had as women and as humans and then as Jews that enable people to connect with us, to understand the story, and to see that it's happening to real people in the world. So, yeah, I'd say it's an empowered and activated women and sisterhood that I would love to see.
No, thank you, Lillian. Ora-Tali?
Something I heard a few years ago, but it's always stuck with me, is the editors of the New York Times Millennium Futuristic Edition, many years ago now, they unilaterally projected Jewish women lighting Shabbat candles in the year 2100. That was the year picked for that Millennium Edition, by publishing the Candle Lighting Times on the front cover of that edition of the New York Times. And I think therein lies my vision. So we will be lighting candles in the year 2100, despite October 7th and God forbid things that happen in the years, to come. I think we'll get there, but there's an inherent tension in the way that Jews advocate for rights and morality. It's more solid for us, it's unwavering, it's the same morals and principles that we've adhered to for thousands of years, whereas the morality of the world and society today waxes and wanes with things, as you say, conversations around gender, or, like a hobby horse and something can take precedence because an influencer has just been paid to endorse that on TikTok, rather than it actually being a pressing issue. And so I think when it comes to advocacy, I'll just say this. It's, don't waste your time, please, in arguing with people on social media. People who appear to be influential in the digital world are not necessarily policymakers or real people who can make decisions and change things at a tachlis level. And also, don't waste your time in just simply regurgitating to your own echo chamber, because I think that there's time, vital time, lost in doing that. And so my vision for Jewish women and men in their advocacy journeys, whether it's, at your local coffee shop or in your professional networks, is to aim your voices higher at people who are real decision makers, because ultimately that's what's going to achieve a real outcome. Support projects like the DINA project and experts who might know more about achieving a tachlis outcome than lay people. And yeah, I think just keep your eye on the prize, because we will be there in 2100 lighting the Shabbat candles. It's just society needs to catch up with us on how we get there.
And lastly, but certainly not least, Ruth, your reflections. Where to next?
Well, thank you for giving us this projection of 2100. It is actually quite reassuring to think about that and envisage this New York Times prediction of being there as Jewish women lighting candles. I think that our role is to take a much, much larger role on the international human rights front at large. And I know that it sounds paradoxical, and maybe I'm actually the least suitable person to say that, because I did speak about my disappointment from the international human rights world. And I know that personally, I did have in mind trying for another role on the human rights treaty bodies framework after CEDAW. And I'm personally, on the personal level, I'm not thinking about that now. However, I did not lose faith in it. And I do believe that if we hadn't have, and if we will not have this framework, the world which will be in a much, much more dangerous place and much worse situation. And for that reason, I think that we need to be there and to influence from within as Jewish women at all times, holding both I'm missing a word in English, sorry. Both goals and both aims as protecting, as working as defenders of Israeli and Jewish women, yet at the same time for the whole of humanity and all of women and gender equality. And it ties together with what I said before about collaborating with other women who had been subjected particularly to this issue of conflict-related sexual violence, but also other challenges that women in the rest of the world are facing. So we mustn't shift to an isolationist mode of action and of activities. It is easy to present us as complete victims, and the whole world is against us, so we need to unite and just fight against the rest of the world. But I think it will be a very, very wrong strategy to take.
No, thank you. And I think the room's in agreement. I think we know that we need allies, we need support, and we need to keep the momentum going. Do we have time for some questions in the room? We do. I've got the nod. Any questions from the audience for any of our panelists from the panel at large? One here. We'll bring the mic over.
Just wait for the mic.
It's for Ruth. I wanted to ask, why wasn't there? Why forensic evidence wasn't taken from the bodies for a whole month after the 7th of October? What happened there? Like to have hard proof about the whole thing, and also to have it to check it.
Lexi, should I respond now, or
Please.
do you want to take questions?
No, please, we'll hand to you.
Okay. Look, for the first few days, the whole area of the Gaza envelope was a battle zone. The war was still ongoing there. The IDF was still fighting to capture or to evacuate all the terrorists. The collection of the bodies was actually done under fire. And I'm sorry, I'll go into some more details now, but I've spoken to those who worked at the Shura military base that was turned into the morgue, and they described scenes from hell, from sheer hell, of hundreds of bodies, 1,400 bodies in one day, piling one on top of the other, many of the bodies coming in burnt or dismembered. And the very first priority was to identify and to give an answer to all those thousands of family members who wanted to know what happened to their loved ones, if they're dead or alive or taken hostage to Gaza. Remember that for weeks we had not known the exact number of how many are hostages in Gaza. So it was to identify the first priority and to bring to burial, in accordance with the Jewish tradition, as fast as possible. And nobody had it in mind that there needs to be taken or performed forensic examinations, such as what known is usually as rape kit. It wasn't on their minds, and it really wasn't possible to do. But I do have to say that there is also some failure here on the part of the authorities, because there were a number of us, women in the civil society, who tried to urge those decision makers in the police and in the military, and to alert them to realize that it possibly was also a crime scene in the sense of sexual assaults and sexual violence, and at least take pictures of the whole body of the victims and not just the faces for the purpose of identification. And that wasn't performed either. Now, it wasn't possible at all to, I was asked this question very often, to extract bodies after the burial and perform those exams. You would have to do that to all the bodies of the women who were buried, survivors of the Nova Music Festival, and of the, not survivors, sorry, victims of the Nova Music Festival and the military bases. It couldn't have taken place. It couldn't have been something that families would agree to. It goes against tradition. It wasn't a question. So the starting point is that the hardcore forensic evidence is limited. That's where we start from. And yet we do have abundance, but it is much more challenging to go through this line and to prove it.
Look, we might take one or two more questions from the audience. Hand up at the back. Thank you.
I'm sorry, my question is for Ruth as well. Thank you for coming and talking with us today. I'm just wondering about your project, about the DINA project, because I see there the Rackman Center is on the screen, and I really wonder who is supporting your project. Is it the Israeli government, or do you get any international support? If you have any lack of resources or anything that you need from us?
Thank you for asking that. The screen is the Rackman Center because the DINA project has become part of the Rackman Center at Bar-Ilan University, which I'm heading. I'm the founding academic director 25 years ago of the Rackman Center. And this project, it was very interesting for me to hear the description of how Project A came about, because it is very similar to how we started working. A number of us were just going in the same directions from October 8, vis-a-vis the international world and also vis-a-vis the international authorities, the national authorities, government, police, military, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, using our previous ties and connections. And very soon we realized that we need to work together. And we started as a WhatsApp group, and then gradually, very, very organically, from the bottom up, we formalized and we decided that we're not going to create any new, NGO or nonprofit or something, but we're going to have this framework, the organizational framework of Rackman Center within a university. And for the almost first year, all our work had been completely voluntary. We were not being paid. We completely, of course, I'm a professor at the university, but besides teaching, I just left everything else, and I hadn't done any research or anything of that sort, and devoted all my time to this project, like my other colleagues on the DINA project. And we are now in the midst of fundraising. Fortunately, we have already been receiving some funds from the JBI Institute in the US, from the Schusterman Foundation, from Hadassah International. We would be very, very grateful for more funding. We have many plans that we want to assume. We did not talk much about the need to engage in a media campaign. All our activities so far had been more, as I said, by briefings and presentations and meetings and our website, and we will enlarge our website. We will translate it to Hebrew, Arabic, Russian, German, but in order to be actors on the social media, which is where the battleground is very much ongoing and will continue to be ongoing. For that, there really needs to be a much, much larger amount of funding. And we'll be happy to discuss that, perhaps in collaboration with other organizations.
Thank you. We've got time for... I'm getting the signal. I think we're at time. We've got a few more formalities, so we will wrap up there. But before we do wrap, I do want to say such a big thank you to the three panelists for joining us, and as well to the audience for our important conversation here tonight. Our discussion illuminated not only the challenges that we've experienced post-October 7, but also the remarkable resilience and solidarity of the Jewish community, but in particular Jewish women. Together, I think as we leave tonight, let's carry that courage, the courage that Ruth has spoken to of the survivors and the victims of October 7, the courage and the resilience of our grassroots initiatives that we've heard here locally from Ora-Tali and from Lillian. Let's create a future where Jewish women in 2100 we'll be lighting candles together, we'll be resilient, we'll have allies in important places, we'll be believed, and we'll be standing up against challenges that are still to come. So thank you again to our panellists for being here, and to the audience. And I think it's really important that we keep this energy and this momentum that we've discussed here alive going forward. I'll hand back to Anna.
Thank you again. Lexi, we knew you'd be good, but you really hit that out of the park. You speak with so much intellect and insight, and you're so engaging, and to manage the tech and the live and the Zoom, you really did an outstanding job. So thank you again. And Ruth, I just want to say to you that you're really on the front line of possibly some of the most painful and challenging work potentially that our generation might see, and to continue with such tenacity and unwavering dedication in the face of really what must be very, very challenging content. I just extend our profound gratitude to you for leading that work. So thank you again, and for being with us tonight. And to Lillian and Ora-Tali, just for showing up and showing us what role modelling and leadership looks like, and taking the courage to make big decisions and taking a leap of faith and just getting shit done, basically. And thanks for being with us tonight and sharing your vulnerabilities as well. Thank you. We have some gifts for our speakers from the amazingly talented Justine Curran, which we will give you in just a moment. And then we have a short video, and I'm going to ask Marlo to come up in a moment and say our final few words, but you guys might just want to take a seat because we're going to show a video and it might be more comfortable. Thank you, everyone.
Invest in me so I can be supported through my journey through high school, be opened up to new experiences and grow.
Invest in me so that I can be a big sister and reconnect with the Jewish community after high school.
Invest in me so I can be the best mother for myself and my family as I find my place in my community.
Invest in me so I can be her shoulder to lean on and encourage her to be the best mum she can be.
Invest in me because I still have so much more to give.
Empower me and other women as we are the future leaders of tomorrow.
Over the last year, we've seen women in our community activate and mobilise and advocate in ways and numbers that we would never have predicted.
Invest in me because volunteers are the heart and soul of National Council. We're transforming people's lives, one by one.
When you invest in us this annual Giving Day, you're investing in the women and girls of tomorrow.
Invest in her.
Invest in her.
Your investment with us today will create a ripple effect throughout our community, building strong, dynamic, empowered women and girls.
Invest in her.
Invest in her.
Invest in her.
Invest in her. Invest in her.
Invest in her.
Invest in me so I can invest in her.
When you invest in her, there's nothing that she can't do.
Thank you so very much for joining us here this evening for an incredibly moving and empowering event. It's an honour to be in this room with so many women who are working so very hard to transform lives. As you saw by the video, our annual Giving Day is coming up, and we're going to be asking everyone to invest in her. And we couldn't have seen stronger reasons than our panel this evening for the work that needs to be undertaken, that has been started and that is being continuing by organisations including the National Council of Jewish Women of Australia, Victoria. For nearly a century, National Council has been a pillar of support for women in our community. Over the years, we've been able to accomplish incredible things, and in every generation, we've tried to answer the call of what needs to be done right now. Dr. Fanny Redding started with the needs of her time, and we've heard tonight about some of the needs of our time. Those girls in the video, they're going to be around in the year 2100. I know, they really are. And we need to make the world safer for them. We need to let them fulfill their entire potential. And we need to have programs and be ready to support women throughout their life cycle, because we know, and those working in international human rights know, that when you invest in the women of a community, you transform the community, right? We know that. Actions make me feel better, Lil said earlier tonight. And that's why I come to events like this and why I'm proud to support National Council and to sit on the board. Because in the wake of such horror as we've been through, and so many disempowering moments, so much disappointment, it makes us a tiny bit feel better to be part of doing something. And everyone in the room was encouraged tonight to keep being an activist. Most of us are volunteers in one way or another, but we need a little bit of help. We need a bit of investment to keep that going. When you invest in her, you're investing in a brighter tomorrow. You're making sure that more girls receive mentorship, more mothers find emotional support, more women leaders have the tools they need to do their job. Together, we can empower women to be the catalyst for the change we all want to see. So I'm asking you tonight to join us in making a commitment to invest in her. You're shortly going to receive a text that asks you to donate. Please give generously. Let's build leadership. Let's keep fostering the resilience we need to keep going and strengthen the very fabric of our community. Thank you for standing with us and with women everywhere. Together, we can create a future that we know, because when women flourish, we can change the community. Toda.